Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Murdoch, and I'm here with Dr. Stephen Peters. Dr. Peters is the co-author of Evidence-Based Horsemanship, and he's someone I've known for about 7 years now. I met Stephen in Ohio, when you lived in Ohio, and I had been just starting out with Surefoot, and I went and spent a day with Stephen and his horses, and it was a really interesting experience. So I've invited him here tonight to talk a little bit about the horse's brain so we can get an idea of what's going on, maybe, when we put horses on Surefoot pads. So thank you so much, Stephen, for doing this.
Yeah, and in fact, all those horses asked me after you left, hey, where's that lady with the pads? When's she coming back? Anyway.
Well, I just remember the bay mare that you were sitting on when she got upset because all the horses ran down into the corner. Do you remember that? Yeah,
she's kind of the leader of the pack.
Right. And you look like you were like a salmon swimming upstream trying to come back. And then all of a sudden she just marched right back up to me and let me put her back on a pad, which was really interesting. Like I've never.
Yeah, under a stressful situation where the pull for her, I can't think of anything else. You know, she certainly wouldn't have stayed for food.
Right.
You know. Well, what you told me is that your students may be at Brain 101.
Yep.
In terms of their horsemanship and brain functioning. So that's exactly where we're going to start. So I've got a slide up here of a huge, well, maybe I should actually tell you, just so you know, I just wasn't the guy that Wendy met on a flight and told me to come jump on the thing. I'm a neuroscientist, actually. And so I've spent my career studying brains and brain functioning. And this is a human brain that I have up on the slide. And what's most pronounced here is that big yellow area. That's the frontal lobe in a human brain. And we do a lot of thinking and organizing and planning and strategizing in our frontal lobe, a lot of abstract thinking. Well, the horse doesn't have that frontal lobe. So here's a horse brain, a model of one, without the big amount of material in the frontal lobe. So at least if we can do one thing, one piece of language that I would like horse people to take out is this whole idea of respect and disrespect. That's an abstract thought, you know, and you might say, well, why is that so bad? Well, one, it's not accurate, it's not scientific, and it really isn't in the best interest of your horse, because you'll start blaming your horse for doing things and maybe even become harsh or punish them when, if your horse is walking in your space, you're sending some sort of message to your horse to tell your horse that it's okay to do that. Or you've inadvertently trained your horse to step into your space. But they don't have a frontal lobe that says, well, I'm just going to stomp on this person's toes, or I know how to do this, but I don't think I'm going to do it today.
I'm so glad to hear you say this, because this is one of the things that I keep trying to get across to people is that they don't process information the way we do, and we keep kind of putting human traits on horses that really aren't true. They can't do those things, right? Like you're saying, the idea of respect. And I'm just so glad to hear you say that. I just want to say that.
Yeah. The horse is a horse, and they're fascinating enough without us adding a human brain element. And if we get a chance tonight, we'll talk about the sympathetic and parasympathetic parts of the autonomic nervous system. But you know, if we're not clear with our horses and we confuse our horses, they only have one default, and that's to go up in the sympathetic nervous system. So what we want to do is be as clear in our messages as we can. And if we think they have a human brain, we're actually talking in a language that they don't have. You know, it's as if the horse speaks French and I speak English. I'm not going to make myself better understood if I just scream in English. Right. Right. On the right-hand side is a human brain, and on the left is a horse brain. And you can see how ours is much more plump. So here's a human brain, and you'll see that what I've got colored here is the motor cortex that operates all the motor signals, and the somatosensory cortex, those are sensory signals. So just like a human, the left side of the horse's brain operates the right side of its body and vice versa. So there's no two brains that are separated. They're well integrated, because think about it. When a horse is in the diagonal, in the trot, messages have to be transferred rapidly between those motor systems. So if I were to cut off all that gray area up there up front and take off the frontal lobe, I would actually have a horse brain. The brain in the middle here is the horse brain, and there's a little gray patch that in us would be frontal lobe, and in them it's actually motor cortex. So they're not designed to do a lot of thinking, and it's a perfect design, because if they're out grazing and they see the grass move and they think they see a predator out there, if they run and bolt from that, all they use up is a few calories. So there's not a lot of room in that little skull case to put enough brain into to burn off enough calories to make it worthwhile. So it certainly is a much better design for them to just bolt when they're up in the sympathetic nervous system. And one of the things we can do with our horses is help them find safety, help them find safe spots, because without that, they only have one default, and that's to fight or flight whenever they're not calm. So what we want to do is show them that they can find a safe spot, and that's actually a good learning spot as well. And just like all of us, we have to feel safe in order to learn. And if we're worried about everything around us, we won't have attention. We need attention. That's the second thing that you need in order to learn. And the third thing, we got to find some motivation. And in our horse, that's easy to do. That's called dopamine. And maybe we'll get to that, but I know that everybody now, it's really become just part of our everyday language. Wendy, at any point, you know, I have a tendency to I could just rattle on.
Yeah, no,
so if you were to just kind of direct me.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is, other than the frontal lobe, our brains are actually really similar. And our responses are also really similar, because what people need is to feel safe.
Yes.
And when people don't feel safe, then they're in a stressful sense of being, and then they don't learn well, and they can't process information. And we actually have the same responses. And I often use sort of a dinner party as an example. And my illustration is, you know, your spouse tells you have to go to the boss's dinner party, and they're going to go to a meeting when you get there. And the first thing you try to do is get out of the dinner party, right? And what's the first thing the horse tries to do is get out of the environment where he feels uncomfortable, because he doesn't feel safe. And then you get to the dinner party, and the first thing you do is look for the exits. How do you get out of the room? And then you go to the bar, right? And the horse can't go to the bar. He can't go get a drink to make himself feel more comfortable. And so what does he do? He nervously grazes. What do? We go to the dining room table and see what kind of snacks they have, right? Or we look for a friend who has horses. Maybe we've seen him 2 years before at a horse show, and we're like, oh, that person has horses. And we go and associate with them. We flock just like the horses. So, you know, what you're describing here in terms of the actual brain itself, the structures, there's this huge similarity. And I think the more we realize we're the same as opposed to we're different, and yes, there are differences, but these core basic things are the same in horses and people.
That's a really good point, because nature did not go back with each animal and recreate what it already made. Mm-hmm. So we already had this reptilian brain with lots of, you know, automatic responses, breathing,
And what part of the brain is
blood.
that?
So we had a reptilian brain, and then we just took an ice cream scoop and actually put a mammalian brain on top of that. And then we went and got a big ice cream scoop, and we put a neocortex on top of that. So you're exactly right. We get in trouble when we think the horse is using its neocortex, which it does not have.
Right.
But all the other things we do have in common. So this sense of self-preservation and fear and startle responses are typical of us and of horses when we're not safe.
So what part of the brain is that reptilian sort of survival part of the brain?
It's largely the brain stem up into the limbic system. And, you know, I know you're let's see if I can find a,
Oh, that's cool.
well, yeah, you know, I think maybe we'll get off track a little bit here, but I guess that's okay.
Yeah.
As we bump onto some interesting stuff, because this could be relevant. That, you know, B.F. Skinner was one of the founders of behaviorism, and animal behaviorism became a big subject of study, and in England it became really popular. And the idea was, well, we can measure the stimulus, what we present the animal with, and we can measure the output. What does this animal do when we provide the stimulus? And we always said, well, the black box is the brain. We can't say anything about that because we don't really know what's going on in there. Well, actually, we do. So this is a horse getting an MRI, a horse getting a CT scan. You know, now we can even put electrodes. This is a halter top with electrodes on there, and we can even decide where we want to put those electrodes on the brain to look at electrical activity. So this is fascinating stuff. There's a German group, and I have some slides of a really powerful MRI that's taken pictures of horses' brains slice by slice and then put them all together and created a 3D image.
Wow.
And we think eventually we're going to be able to put a horse in what's called a functional MRI. And that's an MRI that takes a picture of your brain in real time. So if you were reading a book, Wendy, and I put you in a functional MRI, I could look at the screen and see which areas of your brain you're using to read that book.
So
just think of how amazing.
We could have a horse in a functional MRI and put their foot on a pad and see what happens?
We might, you know, we're going to be able to do that.
I can't
eventually. You know, but what's really cool is we'll actually be able to measure where our learning is taking place in the horse's brain. And, you know, we may even be able to customize the learning to that particular horse because, you know, all horses, even within the same breed, have different demeanors.
Right.
You know? So amazing things are around the corner.
Wow.
Things we never even could have imagined, you know. Okay, here's our brain. You see the spinal cord here.
Yep. And
you come up and there's some internal structures. So there's not much to the reptilian brain. The bulky piece on the end of the brainstem there is the horse's cortex. So that would be its motor strip and its sensory strip, and then a big cerebellum on the back.
Right.
And then we would add, if we were going to have a human brain, we just need one more scoop.
Right.
Yeah. Now, I could point out some things that the arrow that's going to the thalamus, that's an important structure because everything that the horse takes in, except for smell, goes to the thalamus first, and then that thalamus is like a telephone operator that will send it out wherever it needs to go. So you put your leg on your horse.
From all receptors run through the thalamus?
Yeah, the olfactory bulb, well, not the optic nerve, all the cranial nerves, they're all going to send information to the thalamus, and then the thalamus is going to decide where to send that information to.
So it's kind of like a train station, like Grand Central.
It's like Grand Central Station.
My cousin
Sure is.
Grand Central Station, actually.
Exactly. Grand Central Station.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then Grand Central Station will say, well, you're going to Iowa and you're going to, Tuscaloosa or wherever.
Right.
So you're going to the motor strip and you're going to the sensory area. Underneath the thalamus is something called the hypothalamus, hypo meaning below. And that's a thermostat in the brain that kind of controls the horse's emotional state. And if you'll notice, under that is the pituitary gland. So if you read much science about brains, and as they get into the sympathetic nervous system, you may run across a term called the HPA axis. And they're talking about the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are just going to pump adrenaline and cortisol into your horse. So if you're training your horse and you're making cocktails, the last chemicals you want in there are adrenaline and cortisol. Same with humans. If you're out in a dark alley and it's nighttime and you hear some scary sounds, it's going to be really hard to function and do any learning. And that kids in an inner city school, if they think some gang's going to get them while they're in school, well, certainly can't focus on math problems. So here's a brain I've dissected out. And what I've done is I've split it right in half. And this big piece that almost looks like a brain itself that's in the forefront of this picture is the cerebellum. That's responsible for timing and sequencing and fine motor movements. So as a horse hones its motor skills, it'll start to keep a record of that back in the cerebellum.
So
and there's a little slice.
Okay.
Go ahead. No.
A question about the cerebellum. So when a horse is born, for instance, if you have a horse that's supposed to be gaited and he's not gaiting in the field, I always tell people, don't buy that horse because you can't teach him to gait if he's not. It's really hard to do. So is that already pre-programmed into the cerebellum, what that motor pattern is for that individual horse?
They're designed to be on their feet quick as can be. And what they do is they create their own pathways, Wendy.
Okay.
And they do it through activity. So neurons that fire together wire together. So those foals will start to move in crazy positions. And every time they move, the motor strip will fire a pattern. And as they get closer and closer to an approximation of how their mom moves, that wiring will start to do something called myelinate. It's like paving on a highway. And the activity, right? The activity from those neurons firing will actually stimulate the myelin. So those foals are stretching and jumping and leaping. They're not hardly thinking. They're just acting crazy in motor ways. And pretty soon, before you know it, they're up walking and they're running along with mom and playing around. And so, yeah, there's going to be a genetic template in there that gated horse may have to just myelinate those pathways against that genetic template. But they'll come with that template. That's what allows them to stand up and go, or they'd be eaten. We don't have such a template, not like that. So we've got to crawl forever and ever and stumble and tumble.
And our cerebellum is actually a lot smaller than a horse's, relatively speaking, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's one of the reasons that I know they're a motor sensory creature, because the cerebellum is so large. Yeah, if you want to know how important something is in a brain, usually its size will give that away. And so that cerebellum, that's Latin for mini brain. And if you look at the slide, it almost looks like another brain right there on the table.
Yeah.
I draw your attention.
So
Go
when
ahead.
we're training a horse, then motor patterns are being stored in that cerebellum. Like when they start to get a pattern that we're looking for, say, a canter lead on command, they're actually making that pattern and storing it in that cerebellum.
Well, here's what happens is that they'll use a lot of brain at first, and so you teach them a pattern. Then they need to come offline and solidify that pattern, just like we do. We didn't learn to ride a bike in one day. Right. We learned over time, and we got better and better at it. So when we first learned to drive a car, our entire brain was involved. The frontal lobes were ever alert. We were looking out 2 steps ahead. We had to turn the radio off and make sure our mirrors were just right. But after a while, we actually handed it over to the cerebellum and to an area called the basal ganglia. And those areas said, look, this is a piece of cake. We got it now. So those areas of the brain took over that task. And now we can worry about a fight we had with our girlfriend and what we're going to do when we get to work. And we don't even remember how we got to work. That's because other areas of the brain took over. That's how your horse is going to work. You're going to set those motor patterns in, and the horse is going to store those away and almost go to those automatically after a while.
Cool.
Actually, real quick, I'm going to turn on an overhead light just because I'll be sitting in the dark pretty soon.
Yep. There we go. Awesome.
There we go.
So Stephen, I keep hearing this similarity between human brains and horses' brains, and how we learn and how they learn, and how safety is required for us and for learning, and safety is required for horses for learning. So this keeps sort of reinforcing what I've been saying, is that we're, in so many ways, we're the same. That if we look at the similarities rather than the differences, we have our own, we can look at ourselves in terms of how we learn best, and then how would we educate a horse?
Right. You're exactly right. In fact, we assume things of the horse that we would never assume of a human. You wouldn't. So think of a 3-year-old horse out there, and you march out in the pasture because you're running late, and all of a sudden, well, I don't know why he's hard to catch today, right? While you're marching around looking at your wristwatch. So you're already, as sensitive as they are, motor, sensory, they're already picking that up. Mm-hmm. Now, you wouldn't chase some kid around and scare the devil out of them, but you assume your horses, because they're so big, they're going to be able to withstand that.
Yeah.
What your horse is asking you throughout that whole episode is, am I going to be safe?
Yeah.
If you can't answer that, now you've got some what's called norepinephrine or adrenaline and some cortisol already going in their system. Now we rush them out through the gate, and they want to put their head down and graze, not always necessarily because they're hungry at that moment that you want to leave. They're actually trying to reset their nervous system and just calm down a bit, go back into parasympathetic, rest and digest. But we yank their head up, we tie them to the trailer, we brush them off like crazy because we're in a rush. They're prancing all around because they can't get comfortable. So we spank them on the butt because they're doing that. Now we've dumped a couple more cups of cortisol in there. Load them on that trailer. We get off. We know our friends are already headed down the trailhead. Holy mackerel. Stand still for the saddling. And then we take off with our horse, and they see a little boulder, and they spook. And we say, what the hell is wrong with my horse? He didn't spook yesterday.
Yeah.
It's because yesterday he wasn't on 25 cups of cortisol and adrenaline.
Right.
So one of the key pieces here that we often overlook is they're asking you continually, am I safe? And if you can answer that question, they'll stay within an optimal range neurochemically to learn. But if you're not giving them time and space, and you just keep after them and after them and after them, they'll either go up in the sympathetic nervous system and be all over the place, so they can't listen to you when you got them up there. Or if you keep after them constantly, they'll check out on you. That doesn't mean they're not stressed, but they'll just disassociate and they'll go somewhere else because there's just no escape. Well, when your horse is like that, they're not going to learn. And they look safe, and you jump on them.
People think that they're okay, but they're in some state of, a friend of mine, Robin Hood, called it slush. So, they're on the freezy side. They still function, they still move, but they're really checked out in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And sometimes those horses will wake up.
Yes.
And, it's like you're walking a plank. That's another term to look at. This desensitization. This whole idea that we're going to flood our horses with a bunch of stuff, and they're going to eventually ignore all this stimuli. Well, when we flood them, we get them way up high in the nervous system, and they may tune out everything. So let's say we got you in a trance, and you're walking out on a plank, and you're afraid of deep water, and you're walking out on a plank, sort of in this trance. And then eventually a wave comes over your feet and you wake up, and you explode. Yeah. So I don't know how many horses I've seen where people think that they've been taken care of, they've been desensitized, and then they wake up on you. Right. And come apart.
And so for me, I find that word, I agree with you 100%. And I find the word desensitize is A, terribly misleading, and B, not a good idea. That I'm always looking to educate my horse so that he has experiences and he can make good choices because he's learned, okay, that's a rock or that's a tree, or I know this bridge, or I've been over this. And so that's a bridge. This is a bridge. I can do a bridge. Like a person, it takes.
If learning is pleasurable and they get dopamine from the learning, we can create a really great environment where they're almost asking us, well, what's next?
Yeah.
They really become curious. And instead of tuning everything out, they're acutely aware of everything around them, but they don't have to react because they feel safe.
Right.
I'd rather have a horse that's aware.
that word of safety. And it's the same with people. It's the same with us that, if you're a fearful rider, you can't learn anything because you're too busy worrying about that you're not safe. And the minute you start to feel safe and you feel secure, and that's the first thing I do with my students is I help them feel secure and safe. Then the next thing they're starting to ask me questions and engage and interact. Maybe I push them up into the trot and they're not quite ready, but we come back down to walk and we can talk about it. But if they're not feeling safe, nothing is going to help get through that to actually be able to address the issues. There's too much, it's too busy. It's too much in survival.
And they can probably really empathize with their horse. That's great. I'm glad you say that because in that respect, there are a lot of human riders that don't feel safe.
Yes.
And they feel, well, I have to push through this. I have to. And when you see them, they're as tense as a steel robot. Their hands are locked. You can see that there's just no give in them, right? And they're petrified, but they won't admit that. But believe me, their horse knows that.
Yeah, and so they're in that hyper state as well, and either they go into a freeze when something happens because they can no longer respond to anything because they're so over the top, or they go into either fetal or startle, and then they come off. Because they go into protection.
Yeah, and then or they get in such a panic that they can't hear what you tell them anyway.
Right. They absolutely can't hear. It's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, we've got this correlation between what a rider or a person needs for learning. They need to feel safe. They need experiences, and the same with the horse. And with those experiences, then what happens in the brain when we have an experience of learning something new? You use the car as an example, but and you talked about how we recruit more of the brain than we need, but then what's really important after that experience? What do we need? Do we need rest? Do we need a repeated experience? Do we need...
I gotcha.
Yeah.
I gotcha. What we do know, let me see if I got a picture of it. Come on. Oh, I thought I might have.
It's okay.
Yeah,
We're having a good time looking at all the slides.
Here we go. All right. This person's in a functional MRI. Okay. And actually, gosh, I wish I could remember there's a TED Talk on boredom is great for brilliant ideas.
Oh, I saw that. I saw a piece of it. Yeah.
Yeah, which basically says we do most of our learning when we are offline. When you stop incoming stimuli. So you learn something, you need to assimilate it in your brain, right? So this person is in a functional MRI and they're learning a task.
Okay.
What we discovered is that if you just let them lay there after they've completed the task, but you kept the fMRI on, so we're still taking pictures of their brain, what we find is the same areas light up that lit up while they were doing the task. So the brain is replaying what they learned. So what we need is some dwell time. We need some offline time immediately after learning things to assimilate it. But something even more interesting happened. If we waited even longer, new areas of the brain started to light up. So the person began to associate what they just learned with previous learning and said, oh, you know what? Maybe this is related to, I thought I read something about this. And I remember a friend of mine talking to me about this. And we start to form this scaffolding, which is actually a way of just welding together all that knowledge. But what do we need? Space, time, and without outside interference. So what do? We do something great with our horse. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. That horse has no offline time. And then when they finally get it right for the 45th time, we run over there and we slap them. Good boy. Good boy. That's outside interference. You know, it's like you're daydreaming and I come along and whack you on the back. You know, so we think it has to all be us. No, we take advantage of their natural curiosity. And we use that to help them to learn and get dopamine. When they've learned something, we stop and we let them replay it, and we let them lick and chew and come back down in the parasympathetic nervous system where they're calm, and they can then they'll get a serotonin wash. Serotonin is a chemical linked to emotional balance. Mm-hmm. So they'll get it. So after a while, these horses will start to feel emotionally calm and curious. What better things could you have in your toolbox to work with your horse if you've got them feeling emotionally safe and you've got them curious, looking for the next thing?
So this is really interesting because I know that they talk about like digging in the dirt for people increases our serotonin, that, you know, when we get into the earth and work with our hands in the soil. And I know that Prozac used to be super popular. Mm-hmm. Which was,
and Prozac is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It impacts the serotonin system.
Right, so serotonin is kind of our feel-good hormone then? Is that a reasonable way to describe it? Or
I wouldn't go that far. I would say emotional balance.
Okay. So, yeah.
But you need to feel safe to get that serotonin.
So then you're saying like, because it makes me think about
this guy here. Yeah. This guy here right now is getting a big serotonin dose.
Okay.
No outside stimuli. He can be contemplating all kinds of things, and he's feeling emotionally calm. This is a time that you likely get a serotonin wash, and then you start to make associations in the brain.
So because I ride my horse infrequently, because I travel so much, I can remember distinctly when I was home for about 6 weeks and I was working on counter canter. And then I went away for a couple of months. And when I came back, my horse offered instantly, the first time I rode him, he offered me counter canter. So to me, he was working on that idea the whole time I was gone and wanted to like go, hey, look at what I figured out, was the way I read it, you know, because he had the dwell time, if you will, or the time away.
Think of, you know, when you learned to ride a bike and the training wheels came off and you crashed and you skinned your knee and you just couldn't get the hang of it. And if you kept on without a break, you would just get so frustrated. You'd reach a point of diminishing returns and you get worse and worse and worse.
Right.
You put that bike in the garage, you go in the house, you go to sleep. You wake up in the morning and say, well, Dad, before you sell that bike, let me give it one more shot. And you go and you get back on, and lo and behold, overnight, somehow you got better.
Right.
You know, just like the skier who visualizes going down the trail, what they found is if you go once or twice and you do that run perfectly, you're better off to stop and replay that overnight than you are to keep going down, because then you'll get tired. Other things will take your attention. Maybe it'll get windy. So you really can't replay it as perfectly. You can't redo it as perfectly as you can replay it. So this would be a horse here who's back down in the sympathetic nervous system. How do I know that? They're licking and chewing in the parasympathetic.
Right.
Because they're licking and chewing, and that happens in the parasympathetic. There's a cranial nerve, number 9, and its only job is to activate salivation when you go into the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is probably a good place to stop after training. Let your horse lick and chew as much as it will. No outside stimuli, and just let them set with that learning. Because you're right, Wendy, what your horse did was in its brain, replayed that, and we think we need to just be there on top of them. Do it, do it, do it, do it. But you know, that's one of the secrets of the Dorances, who said, right now we're at a good spot. I'm going to turn them loose, and I can get them in 6 months sometimes. And holy mackerel, if they're not, you know, even better than I imagined them.
Right. Because they've sat there and they've replayed that idea and made those connections, and probably were in with that well-being of serotonin because they're out in the field or, you know, with their friends, which is a feel-good environment for a horse.
And if you want to follow that old adage that never let the horse win, then you can get after that horse, run them up there in the sympathetic nervous system. Then they can't pay attention to what you're saying at all. Go ahead and turn that horse out, because you'll get them in a few weeks and they'll be twice as bad.
Right. Because they've made that almost like PTSD, like people, it gets bigger and worse because they don't have a way to process it out.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And why? Just because you wanted to make a point that they couldn't give one over on you, they can't abstract think. They don't have a scorecard with them.
Right. So, okay. So if we're looking at, we've got the brainstem, that's going to be like our survival stuff. Then we've got our motor cortex and the sensory. You talked about the sensory cortex, especially in the horse, and they're close together. So where are they getting these inputs that are going in and they're going to affect, you know, going through the thalamus and all that sort of stuff?
I think I can get there. There it is. The reticular activating system. This is a radar. And so number 1 is the olfactory bulb. That's smell. Number 2 there is the optic nerves. Number 8 down there, Roman numeral 8, that's a vestibular nerve, cochlear nerve, auditory as well. It shares that. So all of this information is constantly coming into your horse. And your horse is processing all this information in, and at the same time making a threat analysis. So not only are they getting sensory information in, but they're constantly asking, is something a threat? you've got their attention, so to speak. You're at the front of the radar. That's where you need to be for the horse to learn. But there's some people start yelling and screaming away from you. Now your horse's attention, the threat level says the threat is over there, and your horse's head moves over there. Right. Or it sees another horse. So that actually now moves to the front of the pyramid for the reticular activating system. So it really is, I said you had to have attention to learn, attention, safety, and motivation. So really it's almost a game of how we can keep bringing the horse's attention back to us, enlisting their curiosity without getting after them when we lose their attention.
So this is a really good point that you're bringing up. And I don't know if you've ever heard of a guy named Julien Bagnon, who worked for Cavalia. And he's recently moved to the States. His wife is American. And he's near me. He lives near me. And I was with him. I went to one of his workshops. He was doing some liberty work. And he was working with the horse, and then the horse just went away, right? And he never bothered he just let the horse go. And it was so interesting because you see so many people, there's a lot of different kinds of liberty work, granted, but you see with a lot of people with liberty work that they have to keep the horse right there. And it was so fascinating because he just allowed the horse to go. Something obviously caught his attention, but then when he went back and he picked the horse up again, the horse was right with him. And it was a different relationship than the ones where you see people like forcing the horse to stay close.
Absolutely. Because one of the things that's almost guaranteed to send your horse up a couple notches in the sympathetic nervous system and create some adrenaline is restraint, any kind of restraint. So we might have to have some, but if that horse is getting more and more nervous and we're putting on more and more restraint, we're just holding that skyrocket as we put the rocket fuel in.
Right.
So you're going to have a horse that's all over the place. So this fellow was pretty wise by just saying, you know what, go check it out. Yeah, I'm not going to fight with you about it, and just reset your nervous system. And then when you're ready, come on back and give me your attention.
That's so cool because that's what, I see so many people and they want to make the horse give them 100%. But I tell people, do you ever give anybody 100% of your attention when you're even learning something you're really interested in? Our mind, we'll hear something, we'll get distracted, we'll, think about what's for dinner tonight, we'll go, did the kids get off the bus? And then we come back into the conversation again, and we might have missed a little bit, but not enough to really miss it. We kind of cruise back into the conversation and we're there again. And yet so many people expect their horses to give them 110% of their attention and not allow them to check out their environment, or if they hear a sound, or if there's another horse that walks in. And so this is a really important point I think you're bringing up, that it's okay to let them drift a little so that they can check it out and make sure it's okay.
Yeah, that doesn't mean, you don't have to be a strict disciplinarian. In fact, horses don't respond well to that. They are so finely tuned that you can do so much more with so much less. Yeah. The horse comes to a water crossing, it wants to put its head down because it has binocular vision. That's where its only depth perception is. So if we yank its head up, we're saying not only, gosh, is this not safe, but I'm not even going to let you check it out. So it's almost like stepping into a scary situation blindfolded,
right.
So I think, and we take away the natural curiosity. If we allow our horse the curiosity to check something out, and it knows it can answer its own question, that's safe. It will carry that lesson for life, and then the horse gets so smart, it says, you know what, I could make myself feel safe here. My rider gave me enough time and space to sort this out. They didn't get after me, and I had time to figure it out. It's like you going off a diving board for the first time. Would you rather just walk down to the edge and look off the edge and maybe dangle your feet and maybe jump off? Or do you want somebody coming up there and pushing you off?
No, absolutely not. So
yeah, you can maintain that optimal state, that homeostasis, if we allow horses to use their natural curiosity. And it's such a great tool because you can use it, everywhere.
And so part of that is being able to be sensitive to knowing, that's a nice picture. Like some horses will go too far, if you will. Like I think about, Feldenkrais always talked about reversibility, that you never go further than you can go back. Because if you go further, like you say, getting shoved off the diving board, you can't recover from that. And sometimes horses tend to put themselves, like I've seen horses with balls, and they go a little too far so that they get scared and they jump back. And people get really nervous that my horse jumped back, or, they kind of overblow the response. But they also didn't stop the horse where there was enough space that if something happened, the horse didn't have to overreact. Does that make sense? Are you following me?
Yeah.
It's like some horses put themselves a little too far into the danger zone.
And, it's not such a bad thing necessarily as they experiment, because they're going to toggle back and forth from the amygdala, which is fear, to an area called the nucleus accumbens, which is a reinforcement area, a pleasure zone. So they get curiosity and they get dopamine and they get curious, but it's a little scary. Then they come back and they start to get a little bit from the fear and self-preservation, but they're still curious. They still want to go back and check it out. So they kind of bounce back and forth. And sometimes they go a little too far. But, oftentimes if you let them even play that game by themselves, they'll actually develop a lot of confidence and curiosity by getting through things. Once again, oftentimes if they get scared and you restrain them, then you get almost an extra dose of this adrenaline, because now they can't escape. And that's their number one anti-predator strategy, is to move your feet and get away from something. So if we take that away, usually they just run a little ways. So I think you're right. I've noticed that if you allow your horse the room to solve problems, the room to explore, your horse will actually start to really come down and become much more of a learner. We know it creates more dendrites, more synapses and connections in the brain if we allow them this opportunity. It's not that they're undisciplined. We're actually using the horse's natural sensory abilities to learn. Right. And it'll pay off for us.
Right. And it's part of it is recognizing when a horse is that the radar system is alerting to maybe this isn't safe, or maybe this is curious. And I think sometimes what happens is people don't read the early signs. And so the horse has gone a little too far, and then it has to react a little more than they wanted. And so, that sets up this kind of anxiety in the rider or the handler, as
in
opposed
both.
to,
and then they just escalate one on top of another. So you have the rider, and the horse may be curious, and his head comes up and his ears go out to whatever that object was. And then the rider misinterprets that as, my horse is getting nervous here.
Right.
So they get a little tighter. And so the horse all of a sudden says, well, I was just checking this thing out, but it must be life-threatening because look at what the rider's doing.
Right.
And then you get this back and forth. A really cool experiment, and I think I've told you about this a number of times, Wendy, but I think your students may find this interesting, is that they took a group of novice riders, okay riders, and then they had another group of expert, really riders with tons of experience. And what they told them is, we're going to take you individually into a barn and close the door. And once you're in the barn, we're going to come, and you're going to be on your horse. We're going to come up to you and open and close a golf umbrella rapidly. So we want you to just be ready for that occurrence. What they did is they took cortisol levels of the riders and of the horse. They can do that with a swab.
Right.
So they got cortisol levels, and they each wore monitors. So variable heart rate monitors.
Oh,
They
cool.
could look at,
I haven't
yeah,
heard
so
about
that
this study. This is awesome.
they could monitor heart rate. So what they found is already the novices seem to have a higher heart rate and higher blood pressure, right? And higher cortisol levels just in the explanation, right?
Right.
So they take them into the barn individually, but they don't do a darn thing. They come into the barn, they say, we're actually not going to do what we said we're going to do. Just go out the other side of the barn, and we're going to take a reading of your cortisol and your heart rate. And they did that with every rider. Well, the expert riders, they thought, even if they come after me with this umbrella, I've got some strategies on what I can do. And I know my horse pretty well. I think I have some things worked out that how we can adjust. So they really didn't go sky high. Here's the amazing thing. Once they got out, they took the cortisol and heart rates of all the horses and all the riders. What they found is that the novice riders' horses also had high cortisol and high heart rate, and the expert riders' horses had low cortisol, low heart rate. So the horse doesn't know what the experiment was.
Right.
What they did was they picked that all up from their rider.
Wow. So here we are again. So
Yeah.
yeah, it so comes back to our ability to, well, it's our ability to feel safe in ourselves so that our horses can feel safe.
Now think what would be, it would be amazing, wouldn't it? If the horse and the rider back and forth could answer each other's question, am I going to be safe?
Yeah.
If you could get in that harmony where your horse is saying, I don't know about this, and you just give them a minute to check it out, and you give them a chance to come back down, and then you feel a little better, and you take a deep breath, and you did this back and forth so that you learn to self-regulate, emotionally regulate, both you and the horse.
Right.
Boy, then that would be a real partnership.
Right. Because then you would trust each other. That would be a big piece. You'd have to trust each other and then help each other in the situation when one of you got a little out of it,
Exactly.
Wow. Super. You know, Stephen, this has been fascinating. It's almost been an hour, and I think this is a really great place. I love having you, and I love having this talk, and I think this has been fabulous, and we've covered a lot of ground. But I think this is a really nice place to kind of bring it to a close for tonight, because we keep coming back to this, that horses and people are the same in terms of the need for safety, the need for curiosity, that riders need to be more curious. And this is what I see in typical instruction is we're told what to do. We're not allowed to explore what we do, right? So we're always trying to get it right, as opposed to have a chance to mess around a little bit and see what happens. Obviously within parameters, but you know, when I do this with my body, what does my horse do? As opposed to, I have to get this just right.
Absolutely. We're all scientists. You have to go out there and experiment. If you're so rigid and judgmental and having to think and stay in your head the whole time, you don't even know what your body's doing.
No. And I always tell my students, you know, we're motor-based creatures, even though we have this big ice cream scoop, as you call it, this frontal lobe.
Yeah.
We're motor-based creatures. We have all the same parts. And if we don't move, then we don't learn, you know, like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I know my patients, they don't get better if I can't keep them moving.
Yeah. Wow. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, topics for another day then.
Yeah. So, you know, like, why don't you just kind of wrap up a little bit about the brain, where we've been, and then I think I'll get in touch with you for part 2.
All right. Well, this has been Brain 101, really, and we gave you a big dose, but largely we wanted to talk about the nervous system and the horse having its only default being fight or flight, and we are not wanting to play a role in sending them up there. Also, tools that we have to use. So there are areas of the brain where we can enlist the horse's curiosity and actually answer those questions that the horse asks you, am I going to be safe? But I think really what was fun tonight was we flipped the coin and we asked the same questions of the riders. Am I going to be safe? You know, and am I way up there in my own sympathetic nervous system? What's my heart rate? What's my cortisol level? And we heard about some things, dopamine that's reinforcing, cortisol and adrenaline that play a role. And after a while, you'll get to know that you're actually in charge of yourself. Take a couple deep breaths, right? And your horse is picking up on you. And experiment, you know, look at how sensitive your horse is. You know, I think you're right. I think we get in these rigid educational schools that don't let you deviate. And it's only in deviating that you really can see where the center line is. If you're over here and over here, you know, that's the only way to really get a picture or a feel.
Yeah. And kind of know where you're on the scale. It was interesting in Costa Rica with the last group. It was a trekking group. And we had everything from a woman who pretty much had not been out of the arena to a couple that did mounted shooting. And, and the woman who had not really been out of the arena, she considered herself an intermediate. But what I realized was her scale was this big, whereas the mounted shooting people, their scale is this big. So they're evaluating their riding ability on a much bigger scale than the person who really hasn't been out of the arena. And it was like really fascinating to recognize that we can, our scale is our limit of our experience, but we need opportunity to experience and explore and do different things so that we increase our scale, and then we can evaluate.
For us and our horses, you're exactly right.
Yep.
Wendy, it's been a pleasure.
Oh, this has been a blast. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad this worked out. And maybe in a couple of months, I'll give you a call and we'll set up another one.
Sounds good. We'll try this again.
Okay.
Well, good night.
Bye.